You are about to listen to a demo of the first 5 chapters of My Brother is Human. This audio has not been finalized and is not reflective of the final product.
My Brother is Human by Kiana Chase. Prologue, September 2000. Curtis had always wanted to be a brother. He had never imagined he would be such a horrible one. "Do you want to go outside and see the baby chicks?" he asked, desperately hoping that Bryce's response would be different this time. It wasn't. Bryce said nothing and kept facing the wall, arms wrapped tightly around his knees. That had been his standard response for the past 30 minutes. "It's more fun than staring at the wall all day," Curtis said. "And you probably want to take your mind off of, well, you know." Bryce turned to glare at him. He still hadn't spoken a single word since he had arrived, but Curtis understood exactly what he was saying. "Go away. I hate you. A lot." Even though he usually wasn't one to give up, Curtis felt like this was hopeless. "I just want to help." Bryce turned back to the wall and wrapped his arms even tighter around his legs. Curtis had done all he could do. He stepped away and wandered into the kitchen, where his mother was still wearing her black funeral dress. She'd only come home with Bryce a couple hours ago and her eyes were still puffy. Curtis sat at the table and rested his chin on his arms. "Do you know how to cheer someone up who watched his mom die?" His mother sighed and opened the pantry door. "Did your father feed you anything besides cereal while I was gone?" Curtis hated it when she changed the subject. She did that a lot, usually when he asked questions she didn't want to answer. "I don't think we can help him," Curtis said, hoping to switch the subject back. "Why couldn't he have stayed with his rich cousins in New Jersey or something?" "A long time ago we promised that if anything happened to Bryce's parents we would take care of him," his mother said. "And something's happened, so we're keeping our promise." "But why would they want us to take care of him? We're just poor and he's not, so how come—" His mother slammed the pantry door shut. "Did you eat anything healthy this weekend?" Curtis knew he wouldn't be getting answers, so he just gave up asking questions. "Well, Dad tried to make me eggs yesterday," Curtis said. "They didn't explode like last time, but—" "That explains the smoke stains on the ceiling. Did you need to use the fire extinguisher?" Curtis lifted his head up and pushed his glasses farther up on his nose. "No, but I sprayed it anyway. It was awesome. There was all this foam and it got everywhere, and I used some of it as a beard after Dad stopped freaking out. I looked like Santa, and Dad laughed and he got the whipping cream out and we had a war." Curtis noticed his mom looked even more tired. It was probably just best to stop talking. "Sorry," he said, tucking his hands under his legs. "You're probably still sad about your friend." "I think I'll always be sad about my friend," she said softly. "Sorry." His mother pulled out a pan from the cupboard and set it on the stove. "Curtis, just because this is a rough time doesn't mean it's wrong to be a little goofy. Bryce and I are just tired. Give us some time." She sprayed down the pan and turned the knob for the front left burner. It flared to life after a couple choking clicks, and his mother left the stove only briefly to retrieve chopped mushrooms from the fridge. "I just want you and Bryce to be happy," Curtis said. "Was everyone this sad when I got adopted?" His mother stirred the mushrooms around in the pan. "No. Did you wear your glasses while I was gone?" "Yeah, mostly. I can't zoom in on stuff when I wear them." "That's the point. And you haven't been running faster than Greg?" "No," Curtis said, spreading his arms over the table. "And I've been really careful, and not making things float, and I only accidentally exploded one thing. Plus, I brushed my teeth." Not every night like she had asked, but he had brushed them, technically, along with the teeth of 3 of the barn cats and the dog. He also tried to brush the teeth of the hens, but it turned out they didn't have teeth. They just had beaks that cracked when they tried to peck him. "Good. I'm so proud of you." His mother dropped a fat square of butter into the sizzling pan. Her voice still didn't sound quite like her voice yet, and Curtis was scared that it never would. She was preparing everything out of order. He watched his mother scrape the chopped garlic into the pan. Within minutes, the kitchen was filled with the irresistible aroma of garlic and butter. His father wandered in from the bedroom and grasped the shoulders of his wife, quietly whispering to her. She didn't respond to him and scooped the mushrooms onto slices of bread, which she arranged on faded china plates. "Eat both of them," she commanded, sliding the plate in front of Curtis. Normally she would have watched him to make sure he ate it, but she was distracted by whatever her husband was saying. Curtis stared at the plate for a few seconds, tuning out the conversation of his parents and wondering how he could dispose of the food without wasting it. It wasn't that the mushrooms were gross, he just didn't feel like eating food, no matter how good it smelled. It felt unnecessary to him. When he could get away with it, Curtis fed his meals to animals. He'd turned several mean cats into friends that way. A brilliant idea sparked inside his head. Curtis grabbed his plate, making sure that his parents were completely distracted by each other, and slowly crept down the only hallway in the house. He darted inside his bedroom, carefully clutching the blade in his hands, and shoved the door closed with his foot. "Hey, Bryce," Curtis whispered. "I've got something for you." Bryce had moved from his spot on the floor to the bed, which had belonged to Curtis until that morning. The fact that Bryce had moved was a good sign, meant his legs still worked. Curtis had been starting to worry. Moving as carefully as he could, Curtis gently placed the plate of bread and mushrooms on the bed beside Bryce and nudged it forward. Bryce didn't respond, so Curtis pushed it a little closer. "It smells really good," Curtis said hopefully. "Aren't you hungry?" Bryce growled, with his throat, not his stomach. Curtis let out a sigh of relief. Growling was closer to talking than silence was. "Oh, phew," he said. "I was wondering if you could still talk, or if your legs worked. So do you want to go outside now, or maybe build a blanket fort, or play Monopoly, or..." Curtis thought Bryce wouldn't reply directly. He was right about that. He also thought Bryce was going to stay still. He was not right about that. Bryce sprung from the bed and latched his fingers around Curtis's throat, slamming his feet into his chest. Curtis fell onto the floor, too shocked to move, even though he was far from hurt. "Listen," Bryce said, shifting his grip from Curtis's throat to his collar. "Right now, I only want one thing. And that's for you to keep your mouth shut. Don't say anything about my mom. Don't pretend to feel sorry for me. Don't try to be nice. Just leave me alone. Understand?" "Yes," Curtis said, staring at Bryce's hands. He was worried about his shirt ripping, but he didn't dare say that out loud. "Got it." "I don't want to play," Bryce said, spitting out the last word like it was rotten. "I don't want to talk to you. I don't want you to touch me. I'm staying in my room for the rest of the day, and I don't want you to bug me." "I got it," Curtis said, trying very hard to stay still. Bryce released him and curled up on top of the bed, both pretending like nothing had happened. That night, however, Curtis was tucked in and kissed goodnight. He could have sworn he heard sobs from across the room. "It's a fantastic day outside," Bryce said. "We should go do something." There was a basketball in his hands, and he was leaning against the door frame. His hair only had a moderate amount of hairspray in it, and his cologne was faint. "Yep, definitely up to something. A fantastic day, but it's snowing again." Curtis reached up and turned to the page of his book, which was still trapped by a golden gravity bubble. "So, fresh air is good air even if it is cold." Bryce sat down on his own bed, rolling the basketball between his palms. "Do you really want to stay cooped up inside?" Curtis pushed his glasses up his nose. "Maybe next week." "Come on, Curtis, it'll be fun, I promise." "Fun, really? Like the taser?" Bryce shrugged and tried to dribble the ball on the warped floorboards, but it refused to bounce higher than 2 feet. "We found out that tasers give you an uncomfortable buzz, so what do you say, 2 shots win?" In response, Curtis mentally grasped the bubble surrounding his book and expanded it around himself, then commanded it to rise up. He slid up the wall and onto the ceiling, legs crossed, and continued to read his book as if Bryce weren't there. "2 shots win," Bryce said. "It'll only take a few seconds. There won't be any handicaps." Curtis peeked over the top of his book to see Bryce dangling from the floor. "I can do anything?" "Even time manipulation if you can manage it," Bryce said. "And you'll leave me alone for the rest of the day," Curtis said. "Absolutely. And you won't do any more experiments on me for the whole weekend." "You have my word." "Any experiments, period," Curtis said sharply. "No loopholes." Bryce shrugged. "Well, it depends on what you define as a loophole, but..." Curtis silenced him with a glare. "Okay, fine," Bryce said. "No loopholes. It will be hard, seeing as you're the subject of my magnum opus, but..." Curtis closed his book a bit harder than he needed to and dropped to the floor, taking a moment to readjust to how normal gravity pulled at him. He was more than suspicious, but quality time was supposed to be really good for Bryce, according to the psychiatrist. It increased his ability to empathize or something. "There we go," Bryce said, slapping Curtis on the back. "Nothing better than basketball." "Are you going to put on a coat or something?" Curtis asked, pointing at the snow drifting outside the window. Bryce swatted the idea away with his hand. "No, don't be ridiculous. If you can go without a coat, so can I." "You're gonna freeze," Curtis said quietly. He plucked Bryce's coat off its hook and tossed it backwards. Bryce nearly fell over as he was hit with the unexpected weight, but he carried the coat outside and slipped it on once the frigid air touched his skin. Curtis knew that the cold was supposed to bother people, but he really didn't mind it. The fact that he could control his body temperature probably had something to do with it. The basketball pad was smothered with salt. Bryce must have been planning this for a while. Curtis stood on the concrete pad, salt crunching under his feet, while flakes of snow drifted around him. When they touched his skin, they instantly transformed into hisses of steam. "Okay," Bryce said, zipping up his coat. "Half court or full?" "We only have one hoop," Curtis reminded his brother, pointing at the hoop. The netting had been loose rope once, but now it was frozen solid and dripping with icicles as thick as fingers. "Right." Bryce tossed Curtis the ball. "You go first." The texture of the ball instantly began to melt under Curtis's fingertips. Curtis lowered the temperature of his hands and dribbled down the tiny court, lifting himself 3 inches above the ground with a gravity bubble. Bryce swiped at the ball, but Curtis spun away and launched the ball into the hoop. It didn't quite make it through the completely solid netting. Bryce darted forward, probably intending to shove the ball up and out of the hoop. Curtis was faster, and he slammed his hand into the frozen net. It shattered like glass, and the ball dropped through. 1-0, Curtis said, just a little smug. "Congrats, you're halfway to victory," Bryce said. "See, this wasn't so bad." Curtis rolled his eyes, but shoved the ball into Bryce's hands. Bryce instantly spun and darted for the hoop. Curtis nearly chased him, but then remembered time manipulation was allowed. He made the bubble around him turn to copper, and he fell, sacrificing flight for the ability of the copper bubble. The world paused, frozen in place. Bryce was balancing perfectly on one toe, the basketball hovering in place an inch below his hand. Snowflakes swirled away from his movements, but they were also frozen in every possible sense. Curtis put his fingers behind the basketball and let his copper bubble dissolve. Bryce stumbled to the side as Curtis intercepted him. Curtis raised the ball over his head and prepared to shoot. He barely noticed Bryce reach for something clipped to his belt, but he did notice the unbearable screams that suddenly exploded in his ears. Curtis yelped and slapped his hands over the sides of his head, and Bryce grabbed the ball away and made the basket almost instantly. Curtis tried to turn down his hearing, but his focus was shaken and he could still feel the screeching somehow. Then, as sudden as it had appeared, it stopped. "I thought you had me there," Bryce said, dribbling back to where Curtis was standing. "What happened?" "Why don't you tell me?" Curtis asked. He pulled his hands away from his ears and stared at the tips of his fingers, half expecting them to be covered in blood. Bryce shrugged. "I can't help you. Your turn to start." He threw the ball into the air and Curtis only barely caught it. Almost as soon as the ball reached his hands, the horrible screams resumed. Curtis wrapped himself in a copper bubble, but the scream remained, frozen in a single pitch that was even more unbearable than before. Curtis grit his teeth and made the bubble turn golden, and time resumed. While he was still trying to get his bearings, Bryce continued down the court and slammed the ball into the basket. He reached down and touched something on his belt, and the screaming stopped. "Look at that," Bryce said. "I win." He pulled a notebook from his pocket and flipped open to a dog-eared page. Curtis drifted over to him and squinted at the page. It was a list of sports. Bryce drew a line through basketball and pocketed the notebook. "Seriously?" Curtis asked, folding his arms. "What?" Bryce asked. "Is it so bad I want to be your equal?" His mother opened the front door, shivering with the cold. "Curtis! Stop floating with it. Any camera can see you. I don't want you ending up like that girl from Orlando." "Okay," Curtis called back as he dropped to the ground. He hadn't heard anything about a girl from Orlando, but he knew his mother had started watching the news obsessively when no one else was around. She was more worried about the broadcast than anyone else. He turned to Bryce and lowered his voice. "Did another broadcast come through?" "Yep," Bryce said. "Last night. All about how alien soldiers are lurking in disguise, people with supernatural abilities should be killed on sight, blah blah blah. Not so much different from the normal nonsense." "Yeah," Curtis said. "Nonsense." "Look, the broadcasts are obviously a hoax and everyone knows it. People are only paying attention because they're being directly biased to television and phones now. Interest will evaporate, just like your ability to play basketball. Curtis snorted and began walking back to the house. How did you do it? I thought you would never ask, Bryce said. He unclipped the tiny device from his belt. It looked a lot like a pen, complete with a button on top. I think I'm going to call it the Shrieker. It only took me a few weeks to make. He cleared the steps with one stride of his lanky built legs and stomped his feet on the welcome mat. I guess the Philly Science Fair will be a piece of cake for you then, Curtis said. Of course, Bryce said. Even though I won't be presenting my real thesis, I'll definitely be taking first. Chapter 2, February 2008. Second, Bryce said, glaring at the second place ribbon. But this was a microplate reader without a filter system and the ability to read up to 7 wavelengths at a time, and a path length correction method based on temperature. He drummed his fingers on the table. It had to be a mistake. He would find the judges and explain that this was all a huge misunderstanding. They had to be somewhere in the sprawling convention hall. It's not about winning, Curtis said, trying to comfort him. No, Bryce said. It's about getting the credit I deserve. He adjusted his collar. I overheard the judges say that the prodigy was going to take first. Naturally, I thought they were referring to me. I've run for the past 3 years. 3 years. And all my previous projects paled in comparison to this one. This is a high-end science fair, Curtis said. You'd think there would be dozens of prodigies floating around. There are, Bryce said, but there is only one who is referred to as the prodigy, and that's me. Let's go. Curtis followed without much resistance, plodding behind Bryce as he wove through the chatty teens, proud parents, and trifold presentation posters. Curtis looked a little out of place in his plaid button-down and jeans, but Bryce had learned long ago that trying to improve the kid's fashion sense was fruitless. Bryce felt a nudge from Curtis, and turned to see where his brother was pointing. A group of people were clustered around a presentation that was definitely bigger than the standard size listed in the handbook. Bunch of bull, Bryce muttered. He pushed his way through the small crowd, Curtis following close behind and folded his arms in order to appear more intimidating. The kid who had won first place was just that, a kid. She couldn't have been more than 10, and had a short haircut that screamed punk. Bryce recognized her at once as Tasha Kratz, a girl who had been featured on a few TV programs because she invented things and people thought it was cute. Hey, Bryce said, approaching his rival. Are you the one they gave the first place ribbon to? Uh-huh, Tasha said. Look, if you want to congratulate me, you'll have to get in line like everyone else. No, I'm here to say that this whole thing is a mistake, Bryce said. The kid rolled her eyes. Let me guess, you got second. Vincent, right? Don't feel too upset. Bryce moved a little closer. I don't know how you slipped past the judges, but this is a high school competition. You're a little too young to be playing with the big kids. I am 13, the kid said, and I am in high school. In fact, this is my senior year. I skipped a couple grades because, I'm a genius. The child prodigy, you can find articles about me anywhere. I'm aware, Bryce said flatly. The kid was well known, but she wasn't nearly as big a deal as she made herself out to be. The only thing that made her stand out from the other prodigies was how exceptionally young she was. If somebody who was even 15 did the exact same thing she did, no one would blink. Tasha absent-mindedly fingered her dark, spiky hair. You're probably just jealous because I revolutionized artificial intelligence while you built a microplate reader that's just an upgraded model of Sailor's initial prototype. I understand. Revolutionized? Bryce seriously doubted that. He glanced at her display, which featured a robot that looked like it had been built out of old toasters and a mechanized Lego set. You bought a build-your-own robotics kit. Congratulations. Tasha rolled her eyes. Jenny, roast him. The robot's neck whirred as it turned to face Bryce. Are you sure your mother didn't dress you, sir? The robot said in a slick, mechanized voice that sounded very much like Tasha's. Though it wasn't fury exactly, something inside of Bryce did not enjoy being insulted via a pile of tinker toys. You've got to be kidding. Impressed? Tasha asked, folding her arms. No, Bryce snapped. There is literally nothing innovative about this. Hey, Jenny, Tasha said, maintaining eye contact with Bryce. "This guy is making fun of you." The robot raised its clunky hands to its LED eyes with twitching, unnatural movements and crying sounds emitted from its speakers. The small crowd watched the exchange, gasped, and clapped their hands. Bryce couldn't believe what he was seeing. He turned to the people clustered around the robot, who were admiring Jenny if it were all the crown jewels of England. Really? This is groundbreaking AI technology? It's not learning, it's not doing anything on its own, it's responding to preset vocal commands. The phone in my pocket does the exact same thing. "Yep," Tasha said with a shrug. "It's still better than what you did. My name's Tasha, by the way." She held out her smug little hand. Bryce refused to take it. He wondered if she'd still be able to build things with a concussion. Curtis, probably noticing Bryce was getting close to throwing a punch, shook the girl's hand. "Nice to meet you, Tasha. We're gonna head back now because Bryce had some real important stuff to do. Right, Bryce?" Bryce just kept glaring at Tasha, cold and hopefully intimidating. She had to have cheated. That stupid robot was only slightly more advanced than a baking soda volcano. Curtis dragged him away by force. Bryce had no choice but to be hauled back to his project and the disgusting second-place ribbon. "She did something," Bryce growled as soon as Curtis let go of him. "She shouldn't have won." "Just let it go," Curtis said. "If you punch someone, especially a kid, Mom and Dad will send you packing. Deep breaths." Bryce drummed his fingers on the table, but reluctantly let himself inhale. "Fine, but next year I'm going to crush her. She'll go home crying. My thesis about you will be finished, and it will be beautiful." "That's not letting it go," Curtis said. "Why don't we go get some ice cream after the award ceremony? Celebrate your victory?" This wasn't a victory. Curtis frowned. "On second thought, let's get an ice cream now." "You can't make me," Bryce said. "I'm staying right here until the judges renounce their mistake." 5 minutes later, Bryce was ordering a triple scoop mint topped with crushed Oreos, but Curtis could tell he was still thinking about Tasha. "Have you ever wondered how ice cream is made?" Curtis asked while their order was being processed. "Assorted ingredients are mixed at freezing temperatures until they become solid," Bryce said in a flat monotone. That was the closest he would ever get to admitting that he was upset. "Oh, gee, I see you have thought about it," Curtis said, the lady behind the counter handing him their order, and Curtis paid her with his own money. Bryce sat down at the table farthest away from the sunlight. Curtis joined him and gently pushed Bryce's triple mint in front of his hands. "If it makes you feel any better, I didn't even place in the drama competition," Curtis said, scooping into his rocky road. "That wasn't a surprise. You're used to being worse than everyone else," Bryce said. Curtis glanced up at him, unamused. "I didn't mean it like that," Bryce said quickly. "I mean, it's just—" "I get it," Curtis said. "But you're right. I am used to it. And you know what? It's not that bad." He forced himself to take a bite, and he had to admit that it was very good. Eating had its benefits. Bryce leaned back, poking at his ice cream. "Whatever. Look, I appreciate everything you're doing, but I just need to feel better. I just need to set things straight with the judges." A chorus of giggles suddenly yanked them out of their conversation. A group of 3 teenage girls came into the shop, each one of them sporting scarves and stylish sweaters. Bryce perked up and wiped a drip of mint away from his mouth. Curtis saw the girls even before Bryce did, and shrank down against the table, bringing his shoulders up to his ears and staring at the ground. An overpowering anxiousness always attacked him whenever there were girls around, especially loud girls. "They're going to come over here," Bryce said, taking another bite. "Why?" Curtis asked. Bryce pointed at his chiseled cheekbones. "Because I'm here, and I'm going to call them over." He waved at them and shot the girls a winning smile. They glanced at him, and then at each other, and then back at him. "There are a bunch of open seats here," Bryce said. "Come sit with us once you've ordered." Curtis really hoped the girls wouldn't take the offer. They did, of course. Once they finished with their order, the girls clustered around their table. "Have we met?" one of the girls asked, looking them both up and down. She had strawberry blonde hair that was pulled up into a high, loose ponytail and bright red lipstick. "We have now," Bryce said. Curtis felt his mouth go dry as the girls giggled. "Sure," she said. "I think we'll sit with you after we get our napkins." The girls distanced themselves and instantly launched into a whispered conversation. Curtis had squeezed his eyes shut and his shoulders had raised above his ears. Bryce nudged him. Hey, straighten up a little bit. They're just girls. They're terrifying, Curtis whispered, refusing to open his eyes. He moved his head a little closer to the table, hiding behind his black curls. And really loud. They're very pretty, though, Bryce said. Yeah, Curtis said, heart knocking against his ribs. Terrifying. The three girls ceased their conference to glance over at Bryce and Curtis's table, and then they all walked over and took their seats. One of them even filled the space next to Curtis. He glanced up at her and then quickly went back to staring at his ice cream. He wasn't used to girls being willing to get so close. Let me introduce myself, Bryce said. I'm Bryce, and this is my brother Curtis. Curtis weakly waved at the new arrivals. Hi. This just prompted a chorus of snickers. Curtis's entire face grew red. He bit his lip and lowered his head again. So, Bryce said, what are your names? I'm Mia, said the strawberry blonde. The second girl, who had curly red hair, raised her hand. Tiff. My name is Zoe, the girl next to Curtis said. Her tight black curls were pulled up into two spheres on top of her head, and her eyes were the color of cinnamon. We're regulars here, Mia said, but I don't think I've ever seen you two around here before, and your accents are funny. What brings you to Philadelphia? Bryce swallowed his ice cream. Academic pursuits. In fact, we just came from the science fair. Zoe glanced over at Curtis. So you're into science and education and stuff? That's exciting. Curtis felt like he was about to have a panic attack. Actually, Bryce is the nerdy one, he said, pushing his glasses far up his nose. I'm just here for him. He does this science fair thing a lot. He's a prodigy and stuff. Curtis's eyes darted nervously back and forth between Zoe and the wall, and he finally decided to stare at the wall. A prodigy? Tiff asked, sounding impressed. Like the Kratz girl? Sure, Bryce said. Science is my passion. I'm currently on the verge of being able to explain where the broadcast came from. He is, Curtis mumbled. He started twisting his spoon into the top of one of his scoops, slowly drilling into the ice cream. Zoe placed her elbows on the table and set her head between her palms. What about you? She asked, staring directly at Curtis with bright, cinnamon eyes. What do you like doing? Curtis looked down at his spoon and saw that the steel handle was mutilated. He frantically slapped his other hand over it to keep it hidden. I, do theater, he said quickly. And, farming. We live on a farm and we do farm things because we live on a farm. That's nice, Tiff said, sharing a look with Mia. Curtis flushed and stared at the ground again. What about you? Bryce asked Mia, abruptly changing the subject. Mia twirled her finger around a strand of hair that had fallen loose. I'm planning on being a fashion designer. While she was distracted, Curtis reached under the table and grabbed a book from his backpack, then opened it up and pretended to read it. Sure you don't want to be a model? Bryce asked. I think you'd be one of the best. He gave her a winning smile and she gave one right back. It made Curtis sick. I actually am going to be a model, Tiff said, jumping in. Bryce asked her a few questions about that, but Curtis didn't hear any of them because Zoe inched even closer to him. Are you doing okay? She whispered. Fine, just, doing homework, Curtis said. Very urgent. Zoe glanced over at the page. The Light Wizard's Apprentice? Curtis said helplessly. That's one of my favorites, Zoe said. Do you mind if I read with you? Without waiting for an answer, she pulled her chair right up next to Curtis's and moved in until their shoulders were nearly touching. You're at my favorite part. You've read this too? Curtis asked. Uh-huh, Zoe said. She rested her chin in her hands. My favorite character is Zolan. What about you? Sarissa, Curtis said quietly. Oh, just wait, Zoe said. I'm sure you'll change your mind by the end. Curtis nodded. His entire brain felt fuzzy and numb. I didn't mean to interrupt you, Zoe said. Keep going. Curtis nodded again and turned back to his book. He couldn't concentrate. No one, outside of his family, had ever dared to come this close to him, not willingly. Logically, he knew that she wasn't afraid he would sneeze on her and set her on fire, or that he'd accidentally break her bones. Still, his instincts took over, and he almost expected Jamie to burst out of the shadows and scream that he was a robot who would kill them all. She never would. These girls knew nothing about him. All they saw was an awkward kid who could barely make eye contact. It felt good. Curtis smiled and kept reading his book, even as his heart kept pounding uncomfortably. Zoe continued reading over his shoulder as the other girls laughed at something Bryce said. Curtis allowed himself to take another few bites of ice cream with his mangled spoon. He glanced over at Zoe, who had obviously finished reading, and flipped the page, even though he hadn't gotten past the first sentence. He would read the rest later. Zoe laughed, yanking Curtis out of his thoughts. "Look," she said, pointing to a sentence. "That has to be the worst pun Justin has ever made." "Ha, yeah," Curtis said, his mouth twitching into a smile. "You'd think that he knows how to make good ones by now." "Maybe he does," Zoe said. "But he just keeps making awful puns because it's funny. No one else seems to have a sense of humor, and he feels obligated to keep the mood light." Curtis shrugged, slowly feeling the anxiousness start to fade away. "Too bad his jokes are rather blinding." Zoe's eyes widened, and then she started laughing. Her laughter quickly turned into a snort, and she snapped her hands across her mouth, shoulders bouncing. "I'm sorry," she finally gasped. "It's just that it was a double pun because of the part in Sarissa's blindness, and I snore when I hear jokes like—" She started laughing again, and quickly began snorting, which just made her giggle even more. Curtis let out a few nervous chuckles, though his smile was genuine. In fact, he couldn't stop smiling. She thought he was funny, and she was cute, and he couldn't help but feel wonderful just by talking to her. "That's all right. I'm like Zolan. I can't help but hook everyone on my words," Curtis said, slyly paying homage to the character's hooked hands. Zoe burst into more giggles and snorts. Curtis kept spouting off puns for the next 10 minutes until he became concerned that Zoe was having trouble breathing from laughing so hard. "Are you all right?" Curtis said. Zoe gasped and took a couple deep breaths. "Yeah," she said. "I guess I'm just a little winded, that's all. You are so funny." "I'm glad you're okay," Curtis said. "I wouldn't want you to die because of some bad puns." "It wouldn't be too bad," Zoe said. "You'd still have a killer sense of humor." Curtis grinned, and the two continued to toss puns back and forth, even though Zoe's jokes often had to be deciphered through her breathless laughter. "I'm sorry, ladies, but I have to go expose my competitor as a fraud," Bryce said after a while. He stood up from the table, grabbing his coat and swinging it over his shoulders. Curtis looked down at his own ice cream, which was only half eaten and quite melted. "Does this mean you're going?" Zoe asked. "Yeah," Curtis said. "I promised to keep him out of too much trouble." "Well, take my number," Zoe said, whipping out a pen and scribbling on a napkin. "It's my cell, so you can reach me any time. I want you to call me when you finish the book. You'll need someone to talk about, and maybe a therapist. It's good." "I don't have a cell, but here's my home phone," Curtis said, writing his number down on another napkin. Zoe grinned and pocketed it. "You're Curtis, right?" "Yeah," Curtis said. "Curtis Sterling." Bryce finished exchanging numbers with the other girls and practically had to wrench Curtis away. There were more goodbyes, and Bryce flirted a decent amount, and then they were outside and walking back to the science fair. Neither of them had said anything for a while. Curtis kept his hands in his pockets, grinning madly, and Bryce's mood had only improved the tiniest bit. "You seem to enjoy yourself," Bryce said, breaking the disjointed silence. "There was enough chemistry on your side of the table to fill a textbook." Curtis said, starting to listen again. "Well, maybe. She's just nice." "She was going nuts about everything you said," Bryce said. "I've only rarely elicited that response. What on earth did you say to her?" Bryce shrugged, hands deep in his pockets. "I just made a lot of awful puns." Bryce snorted. "Impossible. Everyone knows you don't flirt by making puns." The two came to a crosswalk, and Curtis pushed the button embedded in the stoplight. "We weren't flirting," he said. "Just making each other laugh." Bryce shot him a very unconvinced look. "Oh," Curtis said, understanding. Making someone laugh was the definition of flirting, wasn't it? "Ah, so demigods can blush," Bryce said, smirking as the light turned green. "I'm not a demigod," Curtis said, eyes on the ground as he crossed the street. "Right, I forgot. You're part of a secret alien invasion," Bryce said. "Anyway, you're something. I can't wait till my thesis is finished and I can prove it." "I'm human," Curtis said very firmly. Why was that so difficult for everyone to believe? He had a heart and a liver and a brain just like everyone else. He had thoughts and feelings and hopes and dreams. That should be all that mattered, right? He glanced across the street to see a large sign posted in front of a house, screaming the words, "SQs are a lie." Curtis shook his head to clear the anger away. "Are you really going to try to get Tasha disqualified?" "Of course," Bryce said, brimming with confidence. "The only reason she got this far is because she's barely old enough to stop wearing diapers, and they're impressed. If they saw our projects blind, they'd pick mine." Curtis shrugged. He didn't understand the science behind either of the products to know if Bryce was right, but he did know that his brother was smarter than average. Bryce began ranting again, using terms and words Curtis could only begin to guess the meanings of. He politely nodded at the appropriate moments, but mostly just tuned him out. In fact, he kept tuning him out even as Bryce proceeded to march back into the building and vehemently argue his case before several people who appeared to be very important. Since the tone of the conversation seemed to be mostly civil, he tuned them all out and stared at the plaster on the ceiling looking for faces. Curtis only came to attention when Bryce started saying something about a lawsuit. He decided it was a good time to grab Bryce by the collar and haul him away. Again. "He doesn't mean it," Curtis said. "He's just really passionate about science, that's all. Don't pay any attention to him." Trying to ignore the stares of the small crowd, Curtis dragged Bryce out the back door. "I hate you," Bryce snapped the second Curtis released him. Curtis just shrugged. "I want to keep you around. Look, I won't always be there to pull you out of every stupid situation you get yourself into, and I'd really appreciate it if you would stop making people angry. And I have a rehearsal in 5 minutes, so I can't stay. You need to go back to the airport and not talk to anyone, okay?" "You don't need to babysit me," Bryce said. "I'm more socially adept than you anyway." "Maybe," Curtis said, "but I also don't try to solve problems by threatening to ruin people's lives." Bryce shot Curtis a glower so deadly it probably would have killed a normal person. "Either way," Curtis said, "I want to see you take first next year, and you won't if they kick you out for being a jerk. So be careful, okay?" Bryce rolled his eyes. "Fine. I'll abstain for what you define as unsavory conduct." Curtis took off his glasses and tucked them into his pocket. "Good. Spot me. Is there anybody who will see me take off?" "No," Bryce said. "Not with a camera, anyway. You'll have to go fast." "Thanks," Curtis said. "See you tonight." He glanced around one more time to make sure no one was watching, even more careful than usual, and then formed a golden gravity bubble around himself. Curtis willed the bubble to go up and rocketed into the sky. There wasn't a sonic boom. In fact, there never was. His clothes didn't even ripple or whip around. The ground just tore away from him. His stomach lurched uncomfortably, and then he was soaking in the moisture of the clouds, the city a toy beneath him. Curtis sighed and floated on his back for a few moments, soaking in the light of the sun and unseen stars. His fear of discovery drifted away, and he let himself think about Zoe. "Someone laughed with me." Curtis smiled and spread his arms out wide. "I really am normal." He snapped his eyes open and shot through the air again, towards home. He kept his fingers outstretched, poking through his bubble and distorting the clouds into swirling mist. And to think, all I needed to do was make a couple of bad puns. Curtis pulled up over the clouds, shooting upwards until he could see the earth stretched below him. America was just a splotch of green and brown surrounded by blue. Perhaps, after seeing it hundreds of times, most people would have grown to take the sight for granted. Curtis didn't. It stunned him every time, and it was always heartbreaking to realize that almost no one had ever, or would ever, see the world this way. His favorite thing to do was to stay completely still, completely free of the planet's gravitational pull, and watch it spin. He wondered if Zoe would enjoy seeing the world like this. Would she laugh, or just watch in silence, with eyes wide as the planet below her? Curtis soared above the globe, noting landmarks that were only significant to him. His home was tucked away below the Great Lakes, where the ground was dark green and checkered with lighter patches that signified farms and fields. Though he likely traveled much faster than the speed of sound, the planet moved slowly beneath him. It took him a couple minutes to reach the place above Indiana, and then he plummeted towards the ground, not too fast for fear of losing sight of his target. Within seconds, Curtis was above a cornfield. He came to an abrupt halt 5 or 6 feet above the earth. His stomach lurched for only a moment before he commanded the bubble to gently float to the ground between 2 rows of corn. In a delightfully good mood, Curtis stuck his hands in his pockets and whistled as he made his way out of the field towards the school. The Silt County High campus was probably the largest structure in a 30-mile radius, swallowing students from a dozen or so small towns and communities. Even then, it was anything but spectacular. Curtis always thought it looked like a sandcastle built by a child with only a couple of cardboard boxes to use as molds. The gym towered over the rest of the campus in the shape of a sand-colored cube. The rest of the school was squished up against its sides in squat, elongated rectangles. Curtis walked in through the doors on the west side, his whistles echoing in the empty halls. The stage entrance was down the hall and to the left of the cafeteria. He could hear indecipherable chatter from the stage long before he pushed open the door and came through. There were not that many actors in the play. They were performing The Foreigner, which had quite a small cast and only one scene with any sort of ensemble. It wasn't Curtis's favorite kind of performance. He preferred musicals. There was something uniting about singing and dancing with other people, even in an ensemble. As Curtis watched his peers mingle with each other, he felt a spark of determination. Normally, he quietly resigned himself to the back left corner and stayed put until rehearsal officially began. Today, however, he had hope that things could be different. Maybe he wasn't as weird as he thought, and all he needed to do was get friends to put himself out there a little. Make a couple of puns, get people to laugh. He wasn't in elementary school anymore, where everyone watched him shatter Lucas's arm on accident. Taking a deep breath, he approached a small group of 2 or 3 teens from the tech crew. They were deep in a rigorous conversation with plenty of laughter. Laughter that died the moment Curtis approached. Okay, maybe this wasn't as good of an idea as he thought. Feeling his confidence drain, Curtis mustered the courage to weakly wave his hand. "Do you need something?" one of the girls, Celeste, asked. The voice she used was higher pitched than normal, and quite strained. "No," Curtis said. "I was just thinking that maybe that I was just crazy, and that people aren't really scared of me." There was a silence as Curtis refused to express his thoughts. It was quite possibly one of the most awkward pauses he'd ever experienced. Come on, say something, you've got this." Curtis cleared his throat and started over. "What did you guys do this weekend?" "Oh, you know," Kyler mumbled. "Stuff." Jeremy, who had been avoiding looking at Curtis when he had approached, and, well, all the time, scraped his foot along the ground. "Hey, I just remembered that we need to, check the lights, make sure they're all set for the ending scene." His 2 companions fervently agreed, and the 3 of them quickly made their way across the stage. It only took a few seconds to pick up their conversation right where it left off. Well, that didn't go as planned, but to be fair, he'd been exceptionally awkward. He just needed to try again and be less abrupt, more natural and smooth. Yeah, he'd had friends for a while when he took ballroom. He turned to see Madison struggling with one of the props, a large wooden sofa. Curtis jogged over, easing the sense of nervousness in his chest. "Need any help?" he asked. Madison grunted. There was no way to tell if it was a yes or a no. Since it was obvious that Madison wasn't getting anywhere, Curtis decided to take a response as a yes. He gently placed his hands and arms on the sofa and pushed. It started to fly across the stage, but he grabbed it before it went farther than a few feet. Curtis let out a sigh of relief and turned to look at Madison, who was staring at him with nothing less than horror. "Must have, hit a slippery patch or something," Curtis said desperately. "Made it glide." "I think I should just probably take care of this on my own," Madison said, voice clipped. "Yeah," Curtis agreed. "That might be best." He hurried away, cheeks burning with embarrassment. Stupid, don't touch anything, don't try to move anything. He knew that, so those were some of the silent rules he'd given himself, in addition to the ones that his mother had enforced. Julia, one of the other actresses, walked onto the stage with a bag slung over her shoulder. Curtis felt a small spark of hope. Julia was a very good person. She never rolled her eyes or participated in gossip or petty drama. Curtis waved at her, grinning. "Hey, Julia!" Julia waved at him and smiled. It resembled a grimace more than a grin, and then scuttled away, and Curtis let his hand fall to his side. He resolved to try again after practice, and began walking back to the corner to go over his lines. One of the other actors, Thomas, caught his arm. "Can I help you?" Curtis asked. Thomas did not look happy, though he never looked happy when Curtis was within spitting distance. "I know what you're doing," Thomas said. "You're trying to find another host." "What?" Curtis sputtered. "Don't even try that. I know what you are. SQ, demon, alien, whatever. The broadcasts say you crawled out of the rift and you're disguising yourself as one of us. But I've known that for years." Curtis sighed. Not this again. I'm not a demon, I'm not an alien, I didn't come from the rift. I'm a normal person and I don't want to hurt anyone. Don't lie to me, Thomas hissed, grabbing Curtis's arm. You're what the broadcasts have been warning us about. Stay away from everyone on this cast. I won't let you corrupt them. I'm not a demon, Curtis insisted. Please let go of my arm. Give me one reason why I should. Thomas started to twist Curtis's arm. I don't want to hurt anyone, Curtis said, afraid to move. He'd learned that the best thing to do in a conflict was to remain still. Thomas narrowed his eyes and twisted harder. You were planning on taking Julia, weren't you? No, Curtis said, exasperated. She's just nice. I wanted to talk to her, that's all. You wanted to turn the most pure, beautiful thing on this entire planet into your new host, Thomas said. I won't let you. I don't even know why you're allowed to come in the school when it's so obvious what you are. I'm not a demon, Curtis whispered. I'm not possessed. Then what are you? It took 3 people to get that sofa to budge, and you pushed it like it was nothing. I was there when you snapped Lucas's arm in half. Curtis clenched his fists and then began to turn blue. Please leave me alone. That seemed to be enough to convince Thomas to listen. He pulled his hand away from Curtis's arm like it had burned him. Maybe it had. Your eyes, he said, horrified. I saw them glow. Oh no. I won't talk to anyone in this class again, Curtis said. Is that enough to make you go away? Yes, Thomas said slowly. He stared at Curtis with smoldering hatred. For now, but I know what you are, and I will stop you. Curtis avoided eye contact as Thomas walked away. He didn't talk or look at anyone for the rest of the rehearsal. The minute it ended, Curtis pulled Zoe's number from his pocket and threw it in the trash. Flashback 1, September of 2000. Bryce decided that he did not like school buses. If someone had set off fireworks, he wouldn't have noticed because almost everyone was shouting. The kids in front of him either hated each other or were very good friends. It was impossible to tell. If the 2 of them weren't shouting, they were smacking their gum or crying or jumping on something or each other. In fact, the only kid who seemed to be quiet was, ironically, Curtis. He had his nose and palms pressed against the window and was looking at rows and rows of corn as if they were the most fascinating thing he'd ever seen. Don't you drive past this every day? Bryce asked, though he could barely hear himself. Yeah, Curtis said, raising his voice over the cacophony of the bus. Bryce rolled his eyes and clutched his journal, regretting his decision to come to school with every bus stop. When he had woken up that morning, Mrs. Sterling had made it very clear that Bryce did not need to go to school today or anytime soon. He had foolishly insisted to attend, but he would not have had he known that the uniform for this school seemed to consist of plaid shirts and ripped faded jeans. He felt more out of place by the second in his button-down and tie. The bus hit a pothole, and Bryce slammed into the seat in front of him. The other kids all screamed, but then continued like nothing had happened. Bryce, on the other hand, was on the verge of panic. Why didn't anyone care? Where were the seat belts? How on earth was this safe? Bryce scrambled back into his seat, heart pounding uncomfortably against his chest. Almost as soon as he sat back down, Bryce was thrown forward by another violent jolt, and his face smashed into the seat in front of him. It wasn't until he'd gotten back in his own seat that he noticed his journal was gone. Just 2 seconds ago, he had foolishly assumed that he couldn't possibly be more frantic. Bryce dropped to his knees and clawed the filthy floor with his hands, panic swelling up in his throat. He couldn't have lost it. He had an entire month's worth of observations written in there. It was almost all he had left to remind him of New Jersey, and it had been a present to him from his Is this your notebook? Bryce's head snapped up to see Curtis holding his journal. Before he could take it back, Curtis opened it. What is this? Curtis asked, squinting at the pages. I can't read it. That's the point, Bryce snapped. He grabbed his journal away and flipped to the entry he was looking for. It's written in a cipher. No one can read it but me. Oh, Curtis said. I thought that your handwriting was just really, really bad. Bryce rolled his eyes. Whatever. That's okay, Curtis said, pushing his glasses up his nose. I don't think it's against school rules to have bad handwriting, even though there are a lot of them. Rules, I mean. Wonderful. You remember the rules, right? Curtis asked, turning his back to the window. Oh no, he was going to start talking again. No, Bryce said, hoping his chilling voice would be enough to keep the kid from talking. It wasn't. Okay, you might have already been asleep when I told you about them yesterday. I can tell you about them again. So the first one is absolutely no flying or making other people fly. Bryce wasn't sure he'd heard right. It was probably just impossible to hear what the kid was saying over the noise of the bus. I can't hear you, Bryce said. So stop talking. Second, Curtis continued, speaking louder. Always make sure to wear your glasses, especially if you're angry or scared. If everything starts to turn blue, take deep breaths and go lean over the sink so the fire doesn't hurt anybody. Even if Bryce wanted to grace that with a response, he wouldn't have been able to. Maybe the noise and the stench caused by dozens of farmer children was starting to get his brain. Did you hear me? Curtis asked, rapping his knuckles on Bryce's skull. Bryce shoved Curtis away and stared at a purple stain on the floor, praying that if he didn't talk, the menace would get the hint and leave him alone. It worked. There were 3 more violent jolts before the bus finally pulled into the school parking lot. Even before the bus had stopped completely, the kids were starting to rush past Bryce and up to the bus door. Bryce realized he was shaking. He took a deep breath through his nose, and his senses became engulfed in the scent of cheap vinyl. Once all the children except Curtis were gone, Bryce eased into the aisle and made his way out of the door. Curtis was right behind him, though the pace of his steps implied that he was impatient. You can run up ahead if you want, Bryce mumbled. Mom says I gotta be nice to you and be your friend and show you around, Curtis said. His determination was disgusting. So I'm gonna be your friend. Bryce snorted and plucked his way down the bus steps, keeping his hands away from the railing, which was likely slathered with germs and farmer diseases. I don't care. Leave me alone. But you need friends, Curtis said. You're super sad and that doesn't get fixed by being mean to everyone else. You don't know anything, Bryce said. Just stay away. Even though he didn't know where he was going, he followed the river of kids toward the playground behind the building. There's so much stuff you gotta know, though, Curtis said. Like how the swing in the middle breaks sometimes. My dad says that it's a safety hazard, but since it only breaks sometimes, that the school leaves it up. And our teacher is named Mrs. Casper. She's not a ghost, but she is super nice, and she only yells sometimes. Plus, we have a class lizard named Bartholomew. His name was gonna be Bartholomew, but then he barfed, so Bryce placed his entire hand over the lower half of Curtis's face, effectively silencing him. Stop. Curtis pushed Bryce's hand away. I'm just trying to help. Newsflash, Bryce said. You are not helpful. I don't care what you do, I just don't want to see you or hear you or think about you. He turned and walked briskly onto the blacktop of the playground. But it's your first day at a new school, Curtis said, easily catching up to him. Everything's different, and it's awful being different on your own. Mom says I'm supposed to be there for you while everything is changing. Bryce stopped walking. He whirled around, hands gripping the shoulder strap of his bag. Stop acting like everything's different! Curtis took a step back, probably worried that Bryce would take him down again. Good, Bryce thought. This kid might be dumb, but he knows I'm a threat. Curtis opened his mouth, closed it, then finally said, Everything is different. Your mom got killed! Bryce swung. His fist only hit empty air, not even grazing Curtis's mess of curls, but it sent the message well enough. Curtis ran off to the playground, going right towards the swing in the middle. Bryce watched him go, and then sat down against the brick wall of the school building. He opened his scientific journal and pretended to write important things until the bell rang. The kids all rushed off the playground to form messy lines behind the doors cut into the wall of the school. Bryce stood up and nonchalantly joined the line that Curtis was in. 2 boys in front of him started wrestling, literally butting heads. If anyone did that at Riverford Academy, they'd be suspended on the spot, Bryce thought. But these boys did not get suspended. A girl behind them just yelled at them when the door opened and they cut it out. Bryce followed the kids in front of him through the door and into a classroom. He sat at the desk closest to the back. Curtis took a seat near the front and then turned around to stare at Bryce and make a nasty face. It was the closest he'd ever come to aggression, and it made Bryce feel oddly satisfied. Hey, that's my seat! Bryce turned sideways to see who was talking. It was a kid with freckles, sunburn, and ridiculously thick arms. Sorry, Bryce mumbled. He slid the strap of his bag back over his shoulder and searched for an empty seat while keeping an eye on the teacher. She was a short woman with hair orange enough that it could have been grown in Florida. She was talking on her phone. Her body was bent over and she had a very worried expression on her face. Bryce wondered what was wrong until she looked straight at him. That's right. Everything was wrong. Bryce broke eye contact and found an empty seat, though it was way too close to the front than where he would have liked. Calmly, as if it was something he did every day, Bryce took out his binder and laid it on the cracked, stained desk. The teacher made her way through the rows of noisy kids, her eyes trained on him and filled with an expression Bryce was already sick of seeing. He ignored her even as she put a hand on his shoulder. "Bryce," she said quietly, "I just got a call from your new mom." "Not my mom," Bryce thought, calmly setting his pencil at the top of his desk. "I just want you to let you know that it's all going to be okay." Liar. "If you ever need anything, I'll be here for you, all right?" "I don't need anything," Bryce said. The teacher looked at him, forehead screwed with worry and pity. Bryce had only been exposed to pity for a week, but he was already tired of it. He hated how adults walked softer and talked quieter now. He hated the way they looked at him. He wished they would go back to treating him like a spoiled brat. "You don't have to be here. You could stay home tomorrow, try to recover from..." Bryce slammed his Argyle notebook on the desk, even though he already had a notebook in his binder. "I said I don't need anything. I don't need to recover. Everything is fine." The teacher squeezed his shoulder. "It's okay to feel sad. I lost my..." Bryce stuck his fingers in his ears until she walked away. Then he pulled out every single one of his pencils and arranged them in order from shortest to tallest, and then by color, tuning out everything going on in the room for at least half an hour. "Field trip," the teacher said. Bryce had only caught the words because ordinarily he loved field trips, and decided to listen for just a little bit, though he didn't look up from his desk. "We'll be going to the Jadewood Museum of Natural History. It'll be very exciting, so be sure to have your permission slips here by tomorrow or you won't be able to come. Does anyone remember why the Jadewood Museum is important?" Bryce looked up to see several hands shoot up from around the room, and a couple were waving violently. I know! A girl with pigtails yelled, practically standing on her chair. "Yes, Lena?" "They have a whole new exhibit about South Vernon," Pigtails said, sounding smug, "because the rift cracked open here. I saw it with my dad." "I know about that," Curtis shouted. "The rift ran around the whole world, but it cracked open right in our field, and my dad dropped an apple down the crack, and it was like whoosh, and it never came out. And then my mom tried to step over it, and it went boom, and she fell on the ground and got her head hurt." "That's right. Did you know that the rift went right through my parents' living room? They were on different sides of the rift. They could see each other, but they couldn't hear each other, because not even sound could pass through." Bryce could hear the unbearable scratching of chalk on the board, but he didn't look up to see what the teacher was writing. "They actually have several pictures of Sterling Farm in the exhibit." "That's where I live," Curtis shouted. "Yes, that's right. Won't it be exciting to see an exhibit about the place where Curtis and Bryce live? At the museum, they also have..." Bryce tuned out again. He didn't care about the fields that had been graced with rips in reality. He cared about rockets. He didn't look up until lunchtime when all the kids were herded out of the classroom like cattle. All eating took place in the cafeteria, and none of the kids were allowed outside until they were finished with their lunch. Bryce picked a table and sat down with the lunch Curtis's mother had packed for him. Nearly instantly, someone tapped him on the shoulder. "Hi, I'm Jamie. I can sit with you, right?" "Why can't everyone leave me alone?" "Yes," Bryce mumbled. Jamie sat across from him, opening her own paper sack while her hair bow slid off to the side. "So you're staying with Curtis? I'd be careful if I were you." Bryce raised his eyebrows and bit into his sandwich. Across the room, Bryce tried to sit down with a bunch of kids, but they all scooted away. "They say he's actually a robot," Jamie whispered. "Sent by the government to spy on us. He sees everything, hears everything, and if you mess with him," she drew a finger along her neck, "he'll take you out. One time, my brother Lucas was just playing around, and Curtis snapped his arm in half." Bryce said. He kept his cool, even though he was starting to get a little worried. "Jamie, you're not telling him Curtis is a robot, are you?" That was Pigtails. Lena, if Bryce's memory served him. "Maybe," Jamie said. "Everyone thinks it." "Don't be dumb," Lena said, rolling her eyes. "Curtis isn't a robot." Bryce let out a gentle sigh of relief. "He's just crazy." And the relief was gone. "Well, he is a little weird," Bryce admitted. "He was talking about flying and stopping time earlier." "My mom says that Curtis has a hyperactive imagination," Lena said, flipping back her pigtails. And that he also might be a schizophrenic. He was really close to the rift, and might have messed with his brain. I think Curtis has a hyperactive everything, to be honest, Bryce said around his sandwich. That made the girls laugh, and he began to feel a little more at ease, but just a little. Jamie unwrapped a cookie. Seriously, though, be careful. Curtis is insane. Hey, guys! The sound of Curtis's voice made all three of them jump. Curtis sat down next to Bryce, dumping the entire contents of his lunch sack onto the table. So what's a schizophrenic? Told you, Jamie mouthed. Don't worry about it, Lena said. It's nothing. She sounded a little nervous. A freak, Curtis, Jamie snapped. That's what it means. Curtis frowned. I'm not a freak. No one said you were, Lena said. She drummed her fingers on the table. Yeah, you did, Curtis said. I heard you. You just said I was a schizophrenic. So you were spying? Jamie asked, folding her arms. No. Lena frowned and put her hand on Jamie's elbows. Don't make him mad. Remember what happened to Lucas? It was an accident, Curtis blurted. I didn't mean to. He just wasn't leaving me alone and... Jamie slammed her hands on the table. His bones were sticking out. He still can't move his arm and it's your fault. Curtis was shrinking into himself, pulling his shoulders up to his ears. I didn't mean to. How do you not mean to hit someone so hard they need to go to the hospital? Jamie yelled. She was making enough noise that the lunch attendant had noticed and was starting to make her way over. Curtis emerged a little bit, angry enough to start defending himself. I said I didn't mean to. I wasn't trying to hit him that hard. I just wanted him to leave me alone. Guys, you might want to cut it out, Bryce said, keeping his eyes on the lunch attendant. Jamie didn't pay any attention to him. Well, guess what, Snotface? You did hurt him. You hit him really hard. Are you going to hit me too, huh? No, I don't want to hurt anybody. Curtis began to blink rapidly and swiped his sleeve over his face as if something were in his eyes. Then how come you keep hurting people? Jamie asked, voice raising even higher. I know it's 'cause you're a freak. Jamie's point was punctuated by the piercing whistle of the lunch attendant. The entire lunchroom went silent, and Bryce wondered if they acted that way because they were supposed to, or they just wanted to see who got in trouble and why. Young lady, I'm afraid I'm going to have to move you to a different table, the lunch attendant said firmly. I don't care, Jamie said. It means I'll be away from the Rift Demon. We don't call names. The lunch attendant took Jamie's arm and led her away. Lena rolled her eyes and then followed, leaving Bryce and Curtis alone. Bryce decided that Curtis wasn't a robot. Robots didn't get angry or nearly cry because robots didn't have feelings. Curtis sighed and laid his head on the table. This happens every time I try to make friends with them. Or anyone. How awful, Bryce said sarcastically. Thank you for understanding, Curtis said, wiping his nose with the back of his hand. I'm going outside. You tried to stop them, Curtis said. That was nice of you. I didn't do anything, Bryce mumbled. Curtis sat up and locked eyes with him. Yes, you did. You said guys. I heard you. Chapter 3. February 2008. Bryce started awake with a cold gasp, and his mouth was instantly full of salty liquid. He sputtered and thrashed in the icy water, then finally found a way to stand up and survey his surroundings. The frigid ocean water only came halfway up to his calves, lapping against his slacks. His head swiveled around, looking for land. All he saw was a cliff, far off in the distance, framed with barely recognizable rooftops. He was home. Bryce slowly started to slosh his way toward the cliffside, the soaked fabric of his pants clinging to his legs. He went only a few steps before he heard his name. Bryce. He swung around, searching for the source of the voice. Mom? Bryce. Her voice was even softer this time, and it came from a different direction. Bryce slowly turned in circles, trying to be as quiet as possible in case he heard her voice again. Bryce! This time it was deafening, coming at him from all sides, so loud it knocked him onto his hands and knees. His palms splashed into the water, and everything up to his collar became soaked. Save me! Bryce's head jerked up from the water, and his mother was standing there, white lab coat rolling with the waves. Her face was pale, eyes already sewn shut. Still on his knees, Bryce reached up and grabbed her wrist. It was cold. Though he wanted to puke, Bryce maintained his hold. "Don't worry, I'll fix this, I can save you." Her form fizzled and then vanished, only to reappear several feet in front of him. "They're coming," she whispered. "Who?" Bryce demanded. His mother pointed to her right, and another figure slowly rose out of the waves, clothes dripping. Bryce's eyes narrowed and then widened in horror as the figure came into full view. Olive jackets, zippers on the shoulders, black hat, scarf covering everything but the eyes, gun in hand. Not again. Bryce stumbled backwards, then reached for his mother. She was already farther away. The figure raised a gun. Letting out a ferocious, terrified yell, Bryce lunged forward, determined to save his mother or die in the process. Something grabbed the back of his shirt and yanked him back just as the gun fired in his mother's direction. The water around his legs turned red, and Bryce screamed, "Not again, not again, not again, not again." As if it wasn't horrible enough, the gun was fired again, and he was again held back by an unseen hand. "Mom!" More salty water dripped from his face, and he tried to break away from whoever had his shoulder in a steel grip. He turned around to shove his captor away, but then froze as he saw his face. "It's too late, son," his father said, then smiled as he let go as a gunshot ripped through Bryce's ribs. "Bryce, wake up!" Something very gently slapped Bryce's cheek that wasn't pressed against the hardwood floor. Bryce jerked away, almost expecting another corpse. His head banged against the bed frame. It took another 2 seconds of mad scrambling before he was on his feet. "What?" "It's 1:15, Curtis said, anticipating his question. "Sit down." Bryce practically fell onto his bed, springs creaking beneath him. He stared at his hands, realized they were shaking, and clasped them together. Curtis walked away, then came back with a cup of hot chocolate and a blanket. If it had been anyone else, Bryce would have refused, but this had become almost routine. Bryce reluctantly tugged the blanket around him and took a sip from the mug. Though the feelings were still there, they were fading. Bryce was slowly protecting himself from them, distancing himself from them, forcing himself not to feel them. It would take a few minutes, but it would work. It always worked. Curtis sat next to him. "This one seemed pretty bad." Bryce shrugged. He could still feel his heart banging ferociously against his ribcage. Curtis furrowed his brow and stared at him. "Are you sure you don't want to see a—" "Yes," Bryce snapped. "I'm fine and you know it. People have nightmares all the time. There's no need to waste money." "Maybe there is," Curtis said. "The dreams just keep getting worse." Bryce shook his head. "You don't even know what's happening. My dreams could be about failing tests for all you know." Curtis glanced at the cup of cocoa in Bryce's hands, which was still trembling. He cocked his chin to the side and raised his eyebrows. "Yeah, sure, like you'd fear that anyway. What was it this time?" Bryce was silent for a moment, and then shakily answered. "My father was there." "I'm sorry," Curtis said quietly. Bryce gave a single nod. "He held me back from her." "Bryce," Curtis said, "do you think it would help if you found him?" "No," Bryce snapped. "He's dead to me. He better actually be dead, and if he's not, I'll kill him myself." Curtis knew better than to argue. He stood up and put on a tape of Enya. Trying to expel the image of his father's uncharacteristic, gruesome smile, Bryce leaned his back against the wall and wiped his forehead with the back of his hand. It came away with beads of sweat. "Is this one of your sleeping nights?" "No," Curtis said. "It's a Tuesday night. I usually only sleep on Sundays and Wednesdays." Bryce nodded and closed his eyes. "Did rehearsal go well?" "Sure." "That's still the voice I've learned to associate with moping," Bryce said, eyes still closed. "Whatever," Curtis mumbled. Bryce couldn't get his mind to clear, so he got up and pulled open one of his desk drawers. He removed a Ziploc bag that contained a single strand of Curtis's hair, and the accompanying stack of papers that held all his observations pertaining to it. He rifled through them until he found the most relevant ones, and switched on the light so he could read them. "At least try to go back to sleep," Curtis pleaded. "No. This sample is about a year old. Can I have a newer one?" Curtis frowned and plucked a single hair from his head. "You're not going back to sleep?" "No." Bryce took the hair and twisted it between his fingers, blocking out the sea of blood with thoughts of defeating his brother at hockey. He'd need to get Curtis on the ring to see how his powers interacted with ice. If he didn't fly, Curtis would be rather clumsy and wouldn't stand a chance. However, Curtis would be able to telekinetically move the puck, but he would have to sacrifice flight in order to do so. Was there a way to keep Curtis from flying, even if it was for a few seconds, or disorient him? Flashing lights and mirrors might do it, especially in a place like the rink. Bryce frowned, deciding to use the lights as a last resort. It was a cheap tactic like the one he had used to win in basketball. There had to be another way. Finally, the ideas and theories pushed away the sewed eyelids and jackets with zippers on the shoulders. Bryce relaxed and took another sip of steaming chocolate. He frowned and swiveled around in his chair to face Curtis, who was tucked into the corner of the ceiling reading a book. "Did you really have all of this ready in case I woke up?" Bryce asked, raising his cup of chocolate. "No," Curtis said, sounding uncomfortable. "How did you make it so fast?" "I stopped time again. I was hoping you wouldn't notice." Bryce smirked, settling back in his chair. "I thought you struggled to control that one for longer than a few seconds. Is your skill finally increasing?" He forced down his interest. The more attention he gave to Curtis's abilities, the less his brother was inclined to share. It was difficult enough to get him to talk about it in the first place. Most of what Bryce knew about Curtis's powers had come through pure observation alone. Curtis shrugged and turned a page. "I don't want to talk about it." "What's wrong with a little experimentation?" Bryce asked, setting his right foot on top of his knee. "It doesn't seem smart," Curtis said. "People have been especially touchy about anything SQs recently." That was an understatement. While other parts of the country had dismissed evidence of SQs as nothing more than clever video editing, many inhabitants of rural Indiana believed what they saw, and believed it was proof of demonic possession. The broadcasts were not a prank, but messages sent by angels to warn humanity. "Forget them," Bryce said. "They hate you anyway. What's wrong with finding more about yourself?" "What if finding out more about yourself means blowing someone up?" Curtis asked. Bryce rolled his eyes. "You won't." "But I could." Bryce took another sip of chocolate. "I could bomb the school tomorrow, but that doesn't mean I stay up late worrying about it." Curtis pulled his legs underneath him. "But you've never bombed a place, have you?" "No," Bryce admitted. "But I did try to poison you once." Curtis's mouth twitched into a smile. "Yeah, you did." "But I learned and grew, and something like that hasn't happened since. For the most part." Bryce retrieved a box of Q-tips from his desk. "Catch." Curtis looked up just in time to catch it. "What's this for?" "Swab one end in your cheek," Bryce said. "You want me to fit this whole box in my mouth?" Curtis asked, looking confused. "No, just one of the Q-tips. Then stick it in the plastic bag and put it on my desk. Thanks." Bryce swiveled back to face his papers, feeling far more confident and relaxed, and yet, he still didn't dare go back to sleep. Chapter 4, February of 2008. Curtis couldn't stop thinking about Zoe. He tapped the end of his pencil on his desk, waiting for the bell to ring. She wasn't afraid of him. No one had ever wanted to talk to him, at least not in English. And she wasn't afraid to walk up to some guy she didn't know and ask if she could read over his shoulder. Who did that? No one, not even the nicest people he knew. Curtis decided to go back to Philadelphia and find out if everyone was like that. Right after school ended, right after Mrs. Walker finished rambling about the difference between evolution and natural science. Right after he could leave his box. There was a box of empty seats around Curtis in every class he had, except when Bryce had the same class as him. He had never grown used to it. In this class, he grabbed a seat next to the window first thing, even though it was in the back and isolated him even more. Something odd got in his nose, probably dust, and Curtis sneezed. He felt an odd pop in the back of his brain and tried not to feel angry that everyone ignored him. Sometimes Curtis wished he could go back to the days before 3rd grade, when he'd get made fun of and called at by the other kids. At least then they acknowledged his existence. Now he wondered if he was dead half the time unless people glanced at him funny. Curtis pulled off his glasses and rubbed them on his sleeve, keeping his eyes down in case he accidentally scorched something. Mrs. Walker abruptly changed the tone of her voice, and he looked up out of instinct. He would have immediately resumed staring at the ground, but something was sitting on the teacher's desk that had not been there before. Something he knew was connected to the pop in the back of his brain. A golden gravity bubble surrounding a pencil and a water bottle. Curtis wanted to dissolve it and leave well enough alone. He really did. But he was bored, and Bryce's words from the night remained in his ears. "What's wrong with finding out more about yourself? They already hate you." The bubble was invisible to everyone else. Not even he could see it when he wore his glasses. Maybe he could just see how long he could maintain it. That wouldn't hurt anyone. Wouldn't even draw attention. Curtis set his glasses on his desk and focused on the bubble, slowly thickening its edges. Something irritated his nose again, and Curtis turned his head to the side and sneezed. The water bottle and pencil, trapped inside the shimmering bottle, shot against the ceiling. They banged hard against the plaster and fell to the ground. Nobody but Curtis heard them hit the tile because they were all screaming. Curtis froze, every limb as stiff as a block of ice. "Curtis Sterling!" Mrs. Walker's voice made him jump, and for once the entire class whirled to face him. Even the terrified girls who were still covering their mouths with their hands. Go to the office and wait there for your mother." Curtis deflated, shrinking himself as he slid out of his desk and through the door. The whispered word of SQ and demon followed him out. Curtis stared at the ground while the counselor, Mrs. Fritz, talked with his mother. "He didn't do anything," his mother kept protesting. "You said just a second ago that he sits in the back of the class, which wasn't even close to what happened." "Yes, but there is no one else who could cause something so unusual." "You don't know that," his mother said, "and even if he could, he wouldn't. I know you feel very protective of your son, but sometimes we have to accept that. I am extremely protective of him, and you know why?" His mother snapped, sounding very dangerous. "Because you can't turn anywhere in this town without hearing rumors about him being a monster that crawled out of the rift, or that he's proof those garbage broadcasts are true. People run away from him, and he's still a good kid who would never hurt anyone. Don't you dare try to tell me that's not truth. He's terrified of hurting people, which is why he's sitting there instead of defending himself. He's never asked for help or complained not once. I'm protective of him because when all he needs is someone to stand with him, he gets turned into the bad guy." "I'm right here," Curtis thought, scuffing the floor with his toe. "I understand," Miss Frist insisted, even though she clearly didn't. "He has a very good heart, and I agree that he would never cause trouble on purpose." His mother relaxed. "However," Mrs. Fritz said, "he still does cause trouble, and these broadcasts aren't helping anyone's peace of mind." His mother stopped being so relaxed. "Excuse me?" "I don't think it's his fault, but I believe the broadcasts are just a prank," said Mrs. Fritz. "So I'm going to suggest something just between you and I. I'm right here." "What?" his mother asked, sounding wary. Mrs. Fritz leaned forward and glanced around. "Have you considered taking him to an exorcist?" Curtis's head snapped up, and he could see his mother stiffen. "I know it sounds, well, a little," Mrs. Fritz said, flushing. "But what if his fits are just a result of him being controlled by something from the other side? We know how close he was to the rift when you found him. Something could have gotten inside." All three of them were very quiet for a moment, and then Curtis's mother gently brushed her palm against her jeans. "If anything evil is inhabiting my son, I think it would do more harm than scaring a classroom with a floating water bottle. We're leaving. You can't prove he's done anything wrong." Curtis jumped to his feet, all too happy to go. His mother grabbed her purse, and they both left the school building, like they were in an enormous hurry. Once they were outside, Curtis's mother stopped and just stared out into the parking lot, clutching her purse to her chest like it was the only thing she owned. Curtis waited for her to start going, but she kept staring, body frozen. "Mom?" Curtis asked softly. "Are you okay?" His mother pulled him into the tightest hug he'd ever had. Curtis started, but gently, ever so gently, returned the embrace and sagged in her arms. "You are not in trouble," she said firmly, cradling the back of his head. Her fingers dug into his dark curls, and she pressed her cheek into his shoulder. "And I wouldn't trade you for the whole world." "I love you too," Curtis said quietly. His mother pulled away and cradled his face in her hands, and stared at him with tears in her eyes for a few moments. A lump swelled in Curtis's throat, but he didn't feel the need to look away. She stood on her tiptoes to kiss his forehead, and for the first time in his life, Curtis didn't even want to wipe it away. Chapter 5. February of 2008. When Curtis got home, he didn't feel like reading. He wanted to fly, but even just thinking about it terrified him, and he doubted his mother would approve. He trekked out into the woods, hands deep in his pockets. Without even thinking, he found himself at the place the rift had once been. Scientists said there was no trace of it left, but when Curtis lifted his glasses, he could see a faint golden glow stream across the ground, going forever in both directions. Curtis sat down against a rock and wrapped his arms around his legs. He flicked a pebble and watched it punch through a tree and shoot out the other side. He sighed and pressed his head into his knees. Why hadn't he just dissolved the bubble? He knew he was going to sneeze again, and he couldn't control his bubbles when he sneezed. Curtis decided to not keep thinking about what happened. He needed an escape, somewhere where no one he knew would tell him to go to an exorcist. Philadelphia. It was 10 minutes before he got there, and by the time he walked into the ice cream shop, he felt much better. There was just something healing about flight, and it was the one power he would hate to lose. Everything else he could live without forever. He wasn't sure what he expected by coming here. He didn't know if Zoe lived near the city at all, much less if she'd be in the ice cream shop. The chances of running into her were very small, but there was still some sort of hope in his chest. He needed someone who saw him as normal. Curtis sat at a table and waited for a miracle, wishing he hadn't thrown out Zoe's number in a fit of self-pity. Now the odds of finding her were horrifically low. After 2 hours of suspicious looks from the employees, Curtis realized how stupid he was and decided to give up and wander the city. Where there weren't buildings, there were patches of snow. It stood out against the concrete like splashes of paint on a blank canvas. There seemed to be a historical marker on every street corner, even in the quiet, unknown parts of the city. After 30 minutes, he found the library. He didn't think it was a library at first. It looked like a massive, ancient Greek palace surrounded by skyscrapers and streets. Curtis stood on the vivacious lawn and merely admired it until he noticed most of the people walking in and out were carrying books. Curiosity brought him to the bank of concrete steps, under the expansive stone archways, and through the front door. Once he was inside, Curtis decided he now knew what heaven looked like. Not only did the rows of books stretch on for an eternity, but sunlight streamed in from dozens and dozens of massive windows. It was the first time he'd ever walked into a completely foreign place and felt like he was coming home. The biography section alone was twice the size of South Vernon's entire library, and he wandered through it unable to stop smiling. He didn't even like biographies. Naturally, the fantasy section was enough to make him question whether he was awake. They had 2 entire rows just dedicated to the works of Clover Lang, one of them a signed copy from 1969. He discreetly flipped the pages and smelled them, closing his eyes as he released a happy sigh. "Curtis?" Curtis jumped, fumbling to keep the book from dropping to the floor. He turned around, clutching the precious novel with both hands. Zoe was standing there, cocking her head and looking amused. She was carrying a stack of 3 or 4 books. Shakespeare. "Hi," Curtis said. He realized that his heart was racing, and he decided it was because he'd been startled. "Do you need something? Are you in trouble?" Curtis gave her a blank stare. How did she know? No, he said. Zoe frowned. "Why are you here?" Curtis pointed at the bookshelves. "There are books," he said, feeling helpless. Zoe tilted her head. "So you weren't looking for me?" "Not just now, no," Curtis said. He felt heat rise to his cheeks and he stared at the ground. "But, it's good to see you, though." "Oh, wow, I am so sorry," Zoe said. "It's just usually when I meet... You know what? Never mind." Her expression suddenly brightened. "So you finished it? The book?" Curtis smiled and kept his eyes on the floor. He had no idea where he should look. Eye contact, right? But too much eye contact was creepy. "Yeah, I finished it." "Was I right about Solon, or was I right?" Zoe asked, grinning mischievously. "You were," Curtis said. "That was one heck of a plot twist." "I know, right? I stayed up until 2 after I had finished, just being mad the whole time. Watterson is a genius." Curtis nodded, slowly relaxing. He was still terrified that she'd treat him like everyone else did, or that she'd start talking about the broadcast, but that terror lurked under the surface of his other emotions. "Have you read The Age of Heroes?" "Have I? Of course, that's the best one." After a few minutes, Curtis offered to carry Zoe's books to a table. He pretended they were heavy and complimented her strength, even though he stammered as he did so. They talked for a few minutes, but somehow ended up reading together at the table, not saying a word. He glanced up to see her reading intently, chewing on the end of one of her tight curls. Her phone buzzed, and she violently shoved it away, slid across the table and clattered to the ground. Curtis quickly grabbed it and passed it back to her, making sure to be very careful. She smiled at him. "Thanks." "You're welcome," Curtis said, feeling his heart rate increase. He started to go back to his book, resume his status as invisible, but she kept talking. "You know," Zoe said, "I never got to tell you, but that day in the ice cream shop was the first time I've laughed like that in a long time." "Same," Curtis said quietly. "So, thanks." Curtis nodded, because he knew if he tried to talk it would just sound stupid. Zoe smiled at him behind dark eyelashes and kept reading. Curtis never would have left, except the library closed. Zoe checked out her books, talking excitedly about her predictions for the next Watterson book. "Cyber will turn out to be the next villain, I know it," she said, placing another book on the stack in Curtis's arms. "Why?" Curtis asked. "Because it would be the most devastating thing if he turned against Turk. And we know he has a history of betrayal." "I don't think it counts," Curtis said, shifting the books in his arms the way he'd seen other people do when they were carrying heavy things. "Cyber is a good guy, and you could tell he really cares about Turk." Zoe rolled her cinnamon eyes and pocketed her library card. "He cared about Autumn, too, but he wasn't afraid to lie to her." She held her arms out. "Can I have my books back?" "If you think you can handle them," Curtis said. "I think you're stronger than you're letting on," Zoe said. Curtis froze, the terror snapping at his face. Zoe tilted her head, but lifted her books out of his grip. "I'm usually here this time of day," she said. "I spend more time at the library than my house." Curtis lightly shook his head, realizing that she had been talking about regular strength, not Herculean ability. She still didn't know. "It's the first time I've been to this library, but I think I'll come here more often. Like Thursday at 3? "I'll be here," Zoe said. "Well, I have to make that bus. See you." "Do you need any help?" Curtis called out as Zoe bounded down the wide concrete steps. "Too late," she yelled, somehow procuring a bus pass while holding the books. "Thanks." Curtis waved, and then she disappeared inside the bus. He shoved his hands into his pockets and looked into the brilliantly painted sunset. He didn't want to go home. He almost thought about just wandering the city all night. But he realized if he did that, no one would be there to wake up Bryce if he had a night terror, or keep Bryce from doing something stupid in general. With a sigh, Curtis found a deserted alleyway and flew home. While his peers were eating and socializing, Bryce sat across from Curtis, hunched over his computer. Losing to Kratz had pushed him to finish his thesis even faster than originally planned. It was going to be groundbreaking. Proof of a new sentient species that had already integrated with humans. Curtis could deny it all he wanted, but Bryce had seen his cells react under a microscope. "What are you working on?" Curtis asked, taking a seat across from him. "Thesis. I've told you before that you don't really have DNA, right? Just something like it. I'm going over all my notes again, and it's like I'm discovering it for the first time." Curtis stared at the ground and untangled the sandwich from cellophane wrap. "Do you have a lunch?" Bryce reached into his bag with one hand, while his other kept writing his thesis and felt nothing. "I must have left it in the car," he said. "I can get it," Curtis offered. Bryce tore his eyes from his computer screen. "No, I'm good. I probably need to rest my eyes anyway." He shut the laptop and put it away. "Oh no," Curtis mumbled. "What?" Bryce asked, slinging his bag over his shoulder. "Those freshmen are looking at my backpack again," Curtis said. "They've started carrying it off, and I think they've made it part of an initiation or something. I keep making it heavier so they won't be able to lift it." "Just tell them to go away," Bryce said. "It's that simple. Stand up for yourself and they'll leave you alone." Curtis swallowed. "It's not that simple." "Of course it is," Bryce said. "Open your mouth and make defiant noises. It's not hard." He retrieved his lunch from his car, waving to people when they called out to him. When Bryce came back into the cafeteria, one of the freshmen was trying to steal Curtis's backpack. Curtis glanced at him but didn't say anything and kept eating his sandwich. The freshman, whose freckled face Bryce did not recognize, managed to lift the backpack an inch off the ground before he had to drop it again. Bryce snorted. He was about to lecture Curtis when Sonia, a girl from biology, approached him. "Hey," she said. "Do you still want to help me with my homework?" "Sure," Bryce said, taking his eyes off his brother. "What did you need help with again?" "I don't understand these classifications at all," Sonia said, pushing her voluptuous dark hair behind her ear. "And I'm struggling with the entire genetics portion of the homework." "Well, lucky for you, I can help," Bryce said. "When are you free?" "Whenever," Sonia said. "Literally whenever. I'm failing so badly." "Let's see," Bryce said. "Looks like I'm free on Tuesday after—" He was cut off by whoops and yells behind him. He turned around to see the freckled freshman standing on top of a table waving Curtis's glasses while his friends cheered wildly. Bryce waited for Curtis to snatch his glasses back, but he didn't. He held his hand out and said a few things that were too quiet for Bryce to hear. "Come on," Bryce thought. "Take them back." "What time on Tuesday?" Sonia prodded. 7, Bryce said absently, still watching the freshman. Once they realized Curtis wasn't going to fight them, the kids started taunting him with the glasses, pretending to snap them back. "Hey," Bryce said, "give those back!" However, his words were completely lost in the cacophony that echoed around the open room. He turned back to Sonia. "Sorry, I bought him those glasses, and they weren't cheap." "That's your brother, right?" Sonia asked, squinting at Curtis. "Yeah," Bryce said. "He doesn't look like your brother." "He's adopted." Curtis didn't take a step towards the kids. He didn't even stand up. Instead, he kept his eyes down and turned back to his food. Sonia started talking to Bryce again, but he didn't hear anything she was saying. He was too focused on the tormentors, even though he had decided not to confront them. If Curtis wasn't going to stand up for himself, he didn't deserve to get the glasses back. Still, the kids were irredeemably stupid if they were going to mess with somebody like Curtis. Stamping down his frustration towards both his brother and the freshman gang, Bryce kept listening to Sonia, trying to focus on her concerns. Behind her, he saw another freshman, one with messy bangs and acne, sneak up behind Curtis with an inflated paper bag. "Come on, Curtis," Bryce silently pleaded. "I know you can hear him. Turn around and glare at him. Do something." Curtis did nothing. The freshman got 2 inches from Curtis's ear and slammed his bags into the paper, exploding with a bang that rang out like a gunshot and caused multiple screams. Curtis started with a yell, and 2 flashes of blue light snapped out of his ears and into the table he was sitting at, leaving a large hole accented with flickering embers. "Demon!" Bryce whipped around to see who was yelling. Someone else had climbed onto a table, and his eyes were wild, nearly mad. He was pointing at Curtis with a blatant destruction. "Isn't it obvious what it is? Look at it, look at what he's done. None of us are safe while it's still alive. How long will we wait before it kills us all? We have to..." Bryce did not remember traveling from one end of the lunchroom to the other, nor did he remember climbing on top of the table or pulling back his fist. He was shockingly lucid as his punch snapped the kid's head to the side and sent him flying in a beautiful arc. Almost before his victim hit the ground, Bryce jumped off the table and grabbed the collar of the dazed protester, who had red streaking down the side of his mouth. He struggled in vain against Bryce's grip, which played a key role in him getting thrown into the wall. Hard. Bryce punched the other side of the kid's face and heard something crack. A circle had already formed around them, full of those shouting for blood, and those pretending they didn't want anyone to get hurt. "Bryce, stop!" Bryce heard Curtis yelling. He decided to ignore him and slammed the vermin's head into the wall again and again and again. The stupid cretin managed to break away and fall to the floor. He tried to frantically crawl across the floor toward freedom, but Bryce grabbed the kid's foot to prevent an escape. Bryce reeled him in like a writhing rope and punched his face again. There was no need to explain himself. Bryce felt the idiot knew full well why he was about to be destroyed, and no apology would be enough to save him. "Stop!" Bryce ignored Curtis again and pulled his fist back. Something very, very strong grabbed his collar and yanked him back. He instantly began unbuttoning his shirt to break free. Curtis grabbed his arms, very gently, and refused to let him move. "Calm down," Curtis said. "Please." "I'm very calm," Bryce said coldly. "I'm calmer than I've ever been." "You're hurting him," Curtis said. Bryce's target was being helped off the floor, clutching his nose. "That's the point." Bryce's victim looked up in horror as he was hoisted to his feet by a couple of friends and carried away, face dripping in blood. Bryce narrowed his eyes and glowered at the idiot, who was limping out of sight. Bryce knew that struggling against his brother was completely useless, so he stood still, hoping that Curtis would let go. Adults began to descend like vultures on a kill, shooing away the other teens and forming a circle around Curtis and Bryce. The other students were terrified, rightly so. Bryce took advantage of it by baring his teeth and counting how many of them flinched. "If you think that I'm going to let anyone discipline me for this," Bryce said through gritted teeth, "you're wrong." 10 minutes later, Bryce was sitting in the school's office with his hands clasped together. The kid he'd beaten up, Thomas Gregory, had been rushed to the hospital. It sounded like he would make it, though when he'd passed out it'd given everyone a scare. A big part of Bryce hoped he would sustain permanent injuries. "You're not even mad," Bryce whispered to Curtis, who sat next to him, eyes closed. The glasses had been shattered by someone some time in the excitement. "You should be mad." "Why should I be mad?" Curtis asked. Bryce scoffed. "Did you even hear what the idiot was saying?" "Yeah," Curtis said. "It wasn't anything new. Alien, demon, now SQ. It's always been one thing or another." "But he said it to everyone. Loudly. That's unacceptable." "It's not a big deal," Curtis said. "He's been saying stuff like that for weeks, issuing threats, all kinds of things. I'm not surprised, and I'm not that upset." There was a simple solution for this. Bryce would simply destroy Thomas's life in a simple plan split into 4 different phases, beginning with, "Bryce, don't," Curtis said. "I'm not doing anything," Bryce mumbled. "Yeah, but you've got that death look. Whatever you're thinking about, don't do it. Please. You're in enough trouble as it is." Bryce broke eye contact with Thomas for just a moment to glare at Curtis. "He deserves it." "Look," Curtis said, eyes still closed. "I don't get why you're so angry. You called me a filthy demon just a couple weeks ago." "Yes, because we were playing Mario Kart and you were winning. This is different. I'm your brother. That vomitous mass isn't. And when he said it, he meant it." Curtis sighed, saying without words that he thought Bryce was hopeless. Bryce went back into staring Thomas down until he was ushered into a more private office. The counselor was a middle-aged woman who was heavy-set and would have been very pretty if she wasn't scowling. "Sit down, Bryce," she said. She had the voice of someone who was doing their best to sound nice. Bryce had originally intended to sit down, but once she spoke, he decided he wasn't going to. "I prefer to stand," he said stiffly. The counselor raised her eyebrows, and Bryce had a feeling that, besides frowning, it was the extent of her ability to express emotion. "I'm Mrs. Fritz," the woman said. "Bryce, do you know why you're here?" "Because I assaulted Thomas Gregory." The counselor leaned back, looking a little relieved. "So I see you understand that what you did was wrong." "Yes," Bryce said, "and I don't regret anything. If I didn't know that my brother was going to hold me back, I had to drive to the hospital and punch Thomas again." "Bryce," Mrs. Fritz said, relief gone, "violence is not the answer." Bryce shrugged and grabbed a paper cup from her desk, filling it with water from the jug in the corner. "I'd venture to disagree. I have a feeling that Mr. Gregory will never even dare to talk about Curtis like that again." "Bryce!" With a smirk, Bryce took a sip of water. That first punch sure shut him up pretty quickly. "Are any of your non-violent alternatives that effective?" Mrs. Fritz was showing a bit more emotion than just her eyebrows could express. "Please sit back down so we can finish." Bryce grabbed another cup and filled it up, and then set it on her desk. "No, thank you. I know what you're going to say. We're going to talk about the consequences to my actions, and so on and so on." "Well, I can tell you where I stand right now. I'm not sorry. Curtis will apologize up and down for me and swear that I didn't mean it, but I did mean it. I know I'm not in trouble because I hurt someone so much as because I disturbed the flow of things." "You didn't disturb the flow of things, Bryce. You have a victim in the hospital. You committed assault." "Then why haven't I been arrested yet?" "Because the police haven't arrived yet." Bryce laughed. "I won't be tricked into your tactics, ma'am. I think I've said all I need to. Good day." He pulled open the door of the office to see 2 men in blue uniforms with badges glaring from their chests. "Oh," Bryce said. "I'm not one for tactics," Mrs. Fritz said flatly. She looked up at the officers and nodded. Bryce just glared at her as handcuffs were tightened around his wrists.
This concludes the demo for the first 5 chapters of My Brother is Human. To be notified when the next portion of the book is uploaded, subscribe to the channel. Thank you for listening.